What's going on, guys? Hope you're all doing well. Now for today's video, I wanted to talk about a movie that I never hear anyone talk about at all. So Disney was on fire in the 1990s, releasing hit after hit every year, and they did a lot to really carve out a new name for themselves after a somewhat disappointing era in the 80s. But one movie that never really reached the same heights that I'm sure they were all hoping for happened to be a remake of one of their classic stories. And they did this, believe it or not, with some pretty cool star power, hiring Dr. Alan Grant in a big role only 1 year after he was in Jurassic Park. Unfortunately, a lot of people seem to have forgotten about this movie, but in my opinion, there's a lot to enjoy here. The Jungle Book is a 1994 action-adventure film directed by Stephen Sommers. In fact, it's from the same Stephen Sommers that would later go on to direct a little movie called The Mummy just 5 years later in 1999. It stars Jason Scott Lee, Cary Elwes, Lena Headey, John Cleese, and Sam Neill. Now, this movie had a lot going for it back in the day, with, like I said, Dr. Alan Grant coming on to not only give the narration at the beginning, but also show up as a primary character in the movie. He's in the entire thing, and it's really cool to see what these cast members were doing like right after Jurassic Park became the biggest movie of all time. Most people remember Sam Neill for showing up in Event Horizon like right after that, while Goldblum showed back up for The Lost World, but this movie preceded both and happened to throw Sam back in the jungle immediately after Jurassic Park, which I'm sure was not coincidental in any way. Now look, I hadn't seen this movie since I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, so it had been a very long time since I'd been familiar with this one, but I gotta tell you guys that upon rewatch, I actually think this movie is one of the best kept secrets from Disney's library in the 90s, and in a lot of ways, I actually think modern audiences would love it if they ever found out it existed. The main character is obviously Mowgli, and the plot here is very basic. When Mowgli was a little boy, he and his dad were hanging out with Dr. Grant and his daughter Kitty. The last time they saw each other, she gave Mowgli a bracelet before the boy was lost to the jungle. They're eventually reunited many years later after Mowgli was presumed dead, and the bracelet kind of lets adult Kitty know that this is who she thought got lost all those years ago. It's very basic, you can't really ruin a plot like this, and it is one of those movies I saw as a kid years and years ago that I forgot about myself a lot of the stuff in this movie, but I'm really glad that I watched it again, and I honestly think all of you guys are going to enjoy it. First and foremost is the tone. This movie is way different to the cartoon version that the company put out in the 1960s, and it's more similar to the remake many of you guys might actually remember from the 90s, 101 Dalmatians, the one with Glenn Close. With that being said, Jungle Book actually goes for a more action-adventure tone that I always really enjoyed. In fact, Roger Ebert criticized this movie for, quote, "the sweet innocence of Kipling's fables about a boy who learns to live among animals is replaced here with an Indiana Jones clone, an action thriller that Kipling would have viewed with astonishment." Look, man, when you say something like that, I know it's meant to be a critique, but a lot of us are all here for it. You see early on just exactly what it is that Roger Ebert was talking about, with Mowgli showing up looking like Liu Kang from Mortal Kombat with a jeweled knife fighting a CGI snake in King Louie's treasure room. How can you not think this stuff is cool? Oh, and another thing, that's just the beginning of the movie, guys. That's not like a spoiler or anything. I was honestly surprised by how much of the movie felt like other Disney stuff at the time. Jason Scott Lee, of course, would later go on to do the voice of David in Lilo and Stitch, but even the growing up scene with Mowgli and the other animal cubs, it kind of reminds me of that part where Simba gets older in The Lion King. In fact, some of the early parts of the movie are like a live-action Aladdin film, only actually good.
Well, that's a first.
But probably the biggest surprise comes with how much of this thing felt like a blueprint for another movie they would make just a few years later called Tarzan. The whole story of a boy whose family was killed as a child and being forced to be raised by animals before getting older. He meets a girl and becomes civilized. All that stuff is done here, and no joke, there's even scenes that look incredibly similar to what happens in that 1999 animated movie. I wouldn't be shocked if this film was used as some sort of plotting out of how they approached Tarzan later on, which is weird because everyone remembers Tarzan. It was a big deal, but literally nobody ever brings up the live-action Jungle Book movie from the 90s, which is kind of a bummer because, like I said, this is actually a pretty good film. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that some of the special effects feature early CGI. None of the animals can talk, by the way, with the film going for a more believable approach, and Mowgli is a grown man for most of the movie. It's a very different type of Jungle Book movie. Also, the music during this whole thing happens to be really cool too, done by Basil Poledouris, who we all know worked on Conan the Barbarian with Arnold. And speaking of Conan, this movie kind of starts off the same way. Little boy Mowgli is hanging out with his dad and Dr. Grant just before the Lord over the Jungle descends upon their camp. Shere Khan, he shows up, he attacks and kills Mowgli's father before the chaos results in a fire devastating the tents and Mowgli being presumed dead by Sam Neill. But things get sorted out later after he meets up with some of the animals from the jungle and they just wind up raising him. He was already carrying around his pet wolf cubs, so that's kind of his ticket into the whole animal world once Bagheera sees him. And after that, the movie kicks off in a pretty fun way. I really like this thing, man. The attack that Shere Khan does on the tents and camps at the beginning of the movie, it's so wild because you've got Dr. Grant here holding the gun and he's like lining it up to kill the tiger and he pulls a Roland Timbo with the gun not going off. This was such a fun period for movies. Again, for those of you who haven't seen this thing, I was kind of surprised to find out how much of a time capsule this was from the era in which it came out. While they do use CGI, like I said, in certain shots, most of the movie's special effects are done via old school blue screen, where an animal is composited in the same image as an actor after being filmed separately. This usually results in some pretty hokey looking imagery, but for what it's worth, it's also one of the last sort of adventure movies to be done on set with actual cameras, whether the assets be composited in or not, so that's kind of cool. Most of the work is from all live animals, by the way, with the utilization of lots of trainers around off camera, so it's kind of cool. You've got people that are specialized to train the bear, people specialized for the panther and the tiger. This was very cool to see real animals not talking, attacking people, and running with Mowgli through the jungle. I really enjoyed this thing. And just like Roger Ebert complained earlier, the movie has a very Indiana Jones sort of feel. Temple of Doom, to be specific, with one of the villain's deaths even being shot in a very similar way to how Mola Ram goes in that movie. It's nowhere near as dark and violent as the Indiana Jones films, but it does offer up some cool kills in its own right, with a couple of them even feeling like they could be straight out of The Mummy, and the final one being really cool on a more Jurassic Park sort of level. Only not as hardcore as that either. It all boils down to like this incredibly cool third act with lots of action and clever balancing of animal attacks and gunplay. Unfortunately, the biggest letdown ends up being how the movie handles Shere Khan, who I always thought was resolved in a really lame way at the end. Those of you who have already seen it know exactly what I'm talking about. No spoilers here. I think I've sold this movie enough, but in the end, I think the reason nobody remembers The Jungle Book has nothing to really do with the film's quality, because it honestly is a good little 90s movie, but it's also a movie that doesn't really leave that big of an impact on you as well. What do I mean by that? Well, it's all very contained, with Mowgli staying in India the whole time, and while all of the actors do a good job, I think it would have been cooler to have him go to England while he was being civilized, just to show off a different location for the middle of the movie. Other than that, I don't really have any complaints at all. I mean, we could get technical with the minor amount of characterizations for everyone, but honestly, this is a live-action version of The Jungle Book, and for what it's worth, I really think it's solid enough to recommend. Just keep in mind, Roger Ebert gave this film 3 stars. Somehow, he gave Anaconda 3.5, and can you believe the Madman only gave The Lost World 2? Good thing y'all got me, right?